Cheers. Let's get started. Hey, I'm Steve Mathis. I'm here today to talk about exposure modes. And that is the little PSAM, usually on a dial somewhere on the top of your camera, depending on which camera you have. This one doesn't have that mode. It's got a little mode dial there, or mode button, and then we change it with the thumb wheel. But a lot of cameras have a little dial that you rotate to the PSAM or auto. There's a bunch of different settings in there. Let's talk about which one to use. And we'll go through a little progression of what those modes do and when you might want to use them and when you might want to use a different one. So let's just get started with the first thing I want to talk about is who this video is for. And if you're an expert and you understand how all these modes work and you're comfortable using all of those modes, then this video is not for you. You should go pause the video and go out and make some photos, because this is more for people who maybe are just using one mode all the time and they understand it and use it well, but want to understand how to use some of the other modes that might be available. And it's also for beginners who have absolutely no idea which exposure mode they should be using. And that exposure mode is really just by saying which exposure mode we're trying to get to a photograph that is exposed properly, the way you want it to be exposed. And that basically means how bright or dark is this image? And how bright or dark do you, as the photographer, want the image to be? So our goal in selecting these focus modes is to get our images as close to being proper for what we want as possible. So it's more about not letting the camera decide how bright or dark your images want to be. It's about how you want the images to look. And that's why we want to get to the progression of the place where we can make the images the brightness that we want them to be and achieve the look that we want as photographers. So we all shoot differently, and we all think differently, and we all have different needs and uses. So anybody that's telling you like you're not a real photographer if you're not shooting in manual mode, ignore them. That's terrible advice, because that might work for that particular photographer who told you that only manual mode works for them. That's fine. But we all shoot differently, and we all don't need to be in manual all the time. So get that thought out of your head. The same could be said for any of the modes. There are people that say, oh, just shoot in automatic all the time. It does a great job. And they're probably right. Like 80% of the time, it probably gets it pretty darn close. But as you progress as a photographer and you want to change the look of your images, you're going to want to use some of these different modes to be able to adjust the aperture and the shutter speed and the ISO separately and or independently. Okay. So anyway, there's a couple of just caveats about this stuff, but now let's just do a real quick summary of what are the typical modes available on most cameras. Most consumer grade and prosumer grade cameras have a full auto mode, and usually on the dial it's like a green button that says auto on it or something. That's just set it to auto, let the camera take care of everything for you. It's going to take care of your exposure, your focus, your white balance, and it's going to do a reasonably good job most of the time. But there are certainly situations where the camera will fail and it won't give you the image that you want. So there's the auto mode. Then we start with the P. The P mode is program mode. And program mode is going to take the scene in front of it, and it's going to try and calculate how fast of a shutter speed do I need and what do I need my aperture to be. And it's going to select those for you and make the photo. You can also tell it to turn on auto ISO as well, in which case it's going to look at all three of those things and try and select appropriate numbers for all of those. So that can be a fully automatic exposure mode as well. If you put it in P mode with auto ISO, the camera's going to take care of all three of those settings for you. It's going to be similar to the full auto mode, but with some other advantages that I'll talk about later. The next one we'll talk about is the S mode, which stands for shutter priority. On Canon, they call that TV. I think probably stands for time value, so shutter speed time. And that's where you're going to use that mode when you know the exact shutter speed that you want to be shooting at. That shutter speed and no other shutter speed will do. You go into the shutter speed priority and lock that in, and then the camera is going to take care of adjusting the aperture and possibly the ISO as well, although I don't recommend that. We'll talk about that later. But you select the exact shutter speed you want, and then the camera will make some adjustments to get the exposure that it thinks is appropriate. The next mode would be the A mode, which is aperture priority. That you'll use when you know the exact aperture that you want to make this photo. And that will achieve the look you want with the depth of field, and or considering how much light is getting to the camera. You might select a wide open aperture, a big aperture, just because it's dark out and you need as much light as possible getting in. But regardless of why, if you know exactly what aperture you want to be at, use aperture priority. And then in M, manual mode, if you know the exact shutter speed you want, you lock that in, and you know the exact aperture that you want for depth of field, you lock that in. And then you can either let the automatic ISO select the ISO for you, or you can lock in the exact ISO that you want as well. So manual mode would be for if you want to lock in a specific aperture, a specific shutter speed, and potentially a specific ISO as well. So you kind of got to know which one of these is most important to the photo that you're making at that time, and then you can select the appropriate mode for that. Okay, so there's the quick summary. Now let's dig into it a little bit deeper, and let's start with kind of a beginner progression of where I'd say if you're a total beginner and you have no idea what I'm even talking about, put your camera just on the little green full automatic mode on that dial. And that's going to allow you to just start making photos, start thinking about composition, start thinking about what subjects you like to photograph, and really start just getting out and making some photos and getting used to, handling the camera and thinking about the scene and thinking about the light and thinking about composition and thinking about timing of making your photo. The automatic mode is going to do great for that because it's going to free up some of the mental space because you've got a million things to think about and none of those are habit yet for you. So start with that. And then once you start, thinking, okay, maybe I'm ready for a little bit more here, the next progression I would suggest is stay in that fully green auto mode, but use some of the scenes that they put in a lot of the cameras. And by that I mean a lot of them say they have a landscape scene or a portrait scene and a action scene, maybe a macro scene. And just start thinking about, okay, I'm walking around, I'm going to make a photo now of this beautiful landscape. Well, instead of just staying in the green full auto mode, go switch it over. I'm going to go into the landscape mode. And the camera's going to make some settings based on the subject that you're shooting. And so like in the landscape mode, it's going to give you an aperture setting that's going to give you a lot of depth of field, and it's not really going to care so much about having a fast shutter speed because in landscape mode, generally, you're not worried about things moving quickly in the frame. So then if you walk down the street and you want to take a picture of a person, you will flip it then to portrait mode. And really it is going to do a better job of getting the settings the way you want for those type of photos. But in my mind, what it's really doing is it's training you for thinking about your settings. So it's going to get you in a habit of, I'm out photographing, I'm about to make a photo, I need to change some settings here. And really all you're changing is that one, but it's getting you in the habit of changing something before you're making photos. Because eventually you're going to be changing a lot of settings. And just to have the habit of knowing that, okay, it's time to make photos, I need to think about my settings. Get in that habit early, and that's a really easy way to do it, is to look at those scene modes and just change that one setting and then go about, still practicing, thinking about all the other things you need to be thinking about. And then once you feel like you're outgrowing the full auto mode, the next way I suggest most people start is to go into program mode with auto ISO. So the program mode we mentioned earlier is for when you don't know exactly the aperture that you want or exactly the shutter speed you want. And then if you put it on auto ISO, you don't know exactly what ISO you want either. And at this point in the game, you don't necessarily know those things. So you're basically just changing your auto mode into this P with auto ISO. But now by switching to the P mode, we're opening up a few new options that will allow us to use some of the more advanced features of the camera than the auto mode will let us. So those things are, once we're in the P mode with auto ISO, we can now use a thing called exposure compensation, which allows us to quickly and simply make the image brighter or darker. Because the camera is looking at the scene and it's trying to decide how bright or dark it thinks your image should be. And a good amount of the time, the camera is going to get that right. But there are a lot of times when it doesn't. And artistically, you might have a completely different vision for this image than the camera does. You might want a really bright, like high key image. You maybe want something dark and moody, and the camera isn't always going to give that to you. So you might have to override it and say, oh, no, I actually want this to be a very dark, dramatic image. And so now in the P mode, in any of those modes, the P, the S, the A, and the M, we can adjust that to make them as bright or dark as we want very easily. So I would suggest going to that P mode with auto ISO right out of the gate and starting to learn to use exposure compensation. That's a whole different subject, but you can find tutorials about that. I've actually done a little bit about that as well. It'll also allow you to change your white balance. So you can now change the color of your image based on, the color that you want the image to look in the final image, which is typically based on what the light is like in the scene that you're photographing, whether it's at sunrise or midday, or if you're in a room that uses incandescent lighting or fluorescent lighting, they're all going to have a different color of the light, so we want to be able to adjust for that. And once you're in one of these PSAM modes, we can now take control of that through white balance. And then the other big thing that shooting in one of these modes opens up is the ability to change your focus mode. Because in the auto mode, you can't change what it is. It's just stuck on the mode that it gives you. So now we can start to think about, do we want a little pinpoint that we can put on a very specific tree? Or do we want the camera to use a zone tracking where we're going to track a bird flying through the frame and we need it to continually focus? Do we want to lock our focus in on the moon while we're shooting a nighttime image? We need to be able to control which focus mode we're in. And in order to do that, you can't do that in the fully automatic modes. So you got to get into one of these modes to be able to change your focus settings as well. So that's kind of where I would start there with P mode with auto ISO. And then you're not thinking about exposure, you're thinking about the other things. Now you can start thinking about focus, white balance. You're still going to be working on composition, and you can now think about brightening and darkening your image. So just keep practicing working through that. And then we'll progress on to the next level beyond that. So once you've outgrown that P mode with auto ISO, then it's probably time to think about what you're shooting in general. And I personally would spend most of my time in aperture priority mode, because the way I like to shoot, the aperture is critical to the look of the image, and it's critical what the depth of field of the image is going to be. So I almost always want my aperture at a very specific place, whether it's wide open at f2.8 or f11 or f16. There's very few situations where I don't care what my aperture is. And there are some, but very few. So I spend a lot of time in aperture priority mode. So that's where I'm going to hang out a lot of the time. You might be different. There are a lot of people, like bird photographers especially, that are shooting birds in flight. They spend a lot of time potentially in shutter priority mode because they have a very specific shutter speed that they want. Say 2,000th of a second if they're photographing an osprey flying by. And they don't necessarily care so much about what their aperture is, because as long as they have enough depth of field to cover the bird, that's all that's important to them. So whether it's f5 or f11, it doesn't really matter, because the bird's going to be within the depth of field, and they don't care if the blue sky or cloudy background is sharp or not. So they want a very specific shutter speed, and they don't particularly care about the other settings as much. And so then we can do the same thing with manual mode, where I use manual mode when I know exactly the shutter speed I want, exactly the aperture I want, and exactly the ISO I want. Now I can turn on auto ISO if I only know I want f2.8 and I want 1,000th of a second. And that's all I care about. I don't care where the ISO goes from here. Then I'll turn auto ISO on. But in manual mode, you use that when you know the exact shutter speed and the exact aperture that you want for that particular photo. Manual mode is not particularly difficult to use and understand, but it is important that you use it appropriately, because you can have a day where the clouds are coming and going and the sun's going behind the clouds and coming out, and the light's constantly changing. That's a really tough time to be shooting in manual mode, because every time the light changes, and it's going to be constantly changing as half the sun is behind a cloud and then it's fully behind and then half the sun comes out, like it's constantly changing. And so it's really hard for most photographers to keep up with those changes on manual mode. So manual mode with auto ISO there would be great as well, because that ISO is just going to float up and down as the light changes. But there are absolutely times when there's consistent lighting, and just locking it in manual mode is great. If the lighting's consistent on your subject, lock it in manual mode and shoot away until the light changes. If you're in a kind of a tricky lighting situation with some backlight and the background's changing, there's a lot of times where manual mode is great for that as well, because as the background changes from a dark background to a light background, your subject is going to be in front of that background, but the camera's going to be changing the exposure the whole time. And so that's not necessarily a good thing either. But by the time you get to that place where you're shooting confidently in manual mode, you'll understand that kind of stuff. Certainly as part of the beginner progression, don't be worried about getting into manual mode until you understand really well how all these things work. So help yourself out by using the technology that's built into these cameras, and they do a really good job. A final thing to note here is that once you're in the P, S, A, and M modes, another thing that you can change is your metering mode. And that's going to be the selection of how the camera is metering the scene. And we've all heard of spot metering, we've heard of matrix metering, center weighted metering. All those are tools to help you as the photographer to decide how bright or dark the image is, and how the camera is deciding how bright or dark the image is. So this isn't a discussion about how to best use those, but I will say my advice on this front for everybody except experts who already know all this stuff, how they all work: pick one mode and use it, and use it, and use it, and use it, and don't change it, and understand how it works. And I would suggest for most people that would be the matrix mode, which is kind of the whole evaluative scene, and that's kind of the default mode that most cameras come with. And understand when the camera is going to make an image too bright or too dark, but don't confuse the situation by changing your metering modes when you really don't even understand what they're doing. There are times to go into spot metering mode, but for the vast majority of people, it's not the right thing to do to be confusing yourself by shooting in spot metering mode or bouncing around between modes when you don't understand them. If you do want to shoot in spot metering mode, learn that mode, what it's about. You can achieve anything you want in any of those modes. Like, you could get perfect exposures every time with spot metering if you know how, but you really have to know how to do these. And so you have to work with those modes a lot until you understand exactly how they work. So try not to freak out about metering modes at this point. Pick one. Generally, I recommend just the matrix metering and get used to how it works and pay attention. You'll start to see how bright it's making images and how dark it's making images as well. Okay, so with that, the final wrap up, just understand that you can achieve anything you want with any of these modes. So I would suggest using them all. Play with them all once you understand what they do, and just it'll start to become apparent to you which modes are appropriate for which situations. But just think about A is when I know the exact aperture I want it to be. Shutter speed, the S or the TV, is when I know the exact shutter speed I want it to be. And then M mode is when I know everything. I want these settings to be locked in exactly the way I want them. Use that. So it's pretty simple, but it does require practice and understanding. And so you just got to get out there and practice and make some photos, and it'll all come together for you. So that said, I appreciate you watching the video. I would like to promote my Africa trip, so please hang in there with me for a minute. But Sue and I, we go to Africa every year, and we do now have our 2024 trip planned and ready to sign up. And so that's going to be happening in late January and early February. We have 2 trips, one to Kenya and one to Tanzania. And they're wonderful. We make amazing photos. We have a great time. It's like first class all the way. It's set up specifically just for photography. It's not like a tourist safari. It is for photography, and we're out there just to do photography. And we spend a lot of time in the field, more than you would as just a tourist. And the vehicles are set up for photography. And anyway, it's a wonderful trip. If you're interested in that, please visit my website, and you can sign up straight through there. So I appreciate you hanging with me here till the end, and I hope this video was helpful for you. I'll see you again on the next video. Have a great day. See ya. Lula slept right through it again. I wish I could sleep like her.